This is Never Close the Inquiry with Nick Hagan. Welcome to Never Close the Inquiry, where I aim to demystify the right for the left and the left for the right. Where if you come as a conservative, I want you to leave knowing a little bit more about liberals. And if you come as a liberal, I want you to leave knowing a little bit more about conservatives. With the whole idea that over time we'll create better conversations, better relationships, better arguments, and maybe 80 or 90 more steps down the road, a better country. I am here with Zach Elwood of Diffusing American Anger, a depolarization endeavor, which is a terrific, I think, page on Substack newsletter. Zach, you write, you talk, you've written a book. You've been published, I think, fairly widely on depolarization. You've been published in a number of newspapers, and just this last week, you were mentioned by the Liberal Patriot in an article, as an account particularly worth following on Substack. Thanks for coming on.
Oh, thanks, Nick. No, it's always an honor when people are interested in talking to me. So I like that people like what I'm doing. So I need all the moral support I can get. So I appreciate it.
That moral support it can be in short supply sometimes in this work.
Yeah, in this work, yeah, for sure.
So tell me what is depolarization? Let's start with that.
Well, I see it as and it can be a tough word to use because polarization can apply. There can be different interpretations of what the word means. You can talk about belief polarization, which is just a group growing to have different oppositions on beliefs, right? Which is a natural thing that happens. But then most people, when they talk about the problem of polarization, they're talking about the contempt, the increasing affective polarization, which is what researchers call it, our contempt and anger and these kinds of negative emotions towards the quote other side. So in that context, some people will, when they hear depolarization, they think, oh, you're trying to change our beliefs and such. But I think it's about, the way I conceive of it. And I think the way most people would conceive of it in the space is, we're trying to bring down the temperature and engage in less contemptuous and more empathetic ways with each other, which in turn I think will, because those things are so related, like our stances are so related to our negative views of each other, our fears of each other, our contempt of each other, because those things are so related. If you bring down the contempt for each other, you'll indirectly and eventually shift what we disagree about, and shift our debates in more healthier ways and less polarized in either or and binary ways, right? So I think seeing that indirectly affects what we argue about is important too. Yeah.
So that was a great description. Um, so there at the end, I think you started to get to kind of what the point of it is. And could you expand on that a little more? Because I think a lot of people, when they hear depolarization and that they hear that as a goal, they think, okay, these are people that they're uncomfortable with conflict. And you hear this criticism from both the right and the left. I think, these are people that are
Mhm.
uncomfortable with conflict. And so they just want, everyone to get along. And
Right.
so we can have a nice Thanksgiving dinner. And they're just ignoring the fact that the house is on fire.
Right. Yeah, that is a common perception. I mean, that's like the number one objection you get in most toxic conflicts in general. The view is that the conflict resolution people are more interested in getting along than in doing the right thing, or working for the right things. And that's just a common, that's the underlying objection to this work in general, is the other side is so bad, we have to focus on what's right and not worry
Right.
about these, this depolarization or this civility. You're overvaluing civility more than what's right, and these kinds of things. So I think, yeah, I focused on, that's a big part of my work, is focusing on that objection. And that's, in my books, I led with these kind of objections and how we can overcome them, because I see that as so fundamental, because conflict just generally leads to people having all sorts of objections to even thinking about these ideas. They don't want to resolve the conflict or don't
Hmm.
see a way. But I think getting people to see how these things have a self-reinforcing aspect to them. The we tend to think of our enemies, our quote enemies, our adversaries, as just kind of like pursuing what they want to pursue. But when you start to see how the way your opponents behave, the way your adversaries behave is directly linked to how they view you, which means like how you react to them is tied into the how the cycle of conflict progresses. And when you start seeing this self-reinforcing nature, which explains so much conflict, interpersonal conflict that quickly ramps up to dangerous proportions, or political conflict, international conflict, there's this self-reinforcing aspect where how one side reacts is then interpreted as threats and insults and all of these things, which makes them behave in more aggressive ways, which is interpreted in the worst way by the other side. It's hard to determine defensive actions from offensive actions and these kinds of things. So I think when you start keying into these things and seeing how they progress and seeing how this is a problem that's been building over decades in America, and also in other countries and throughout history, it just kind of happens the same way. You start seeing the importance of thinking about how you respond to your opponents, and trying to pursue your goals even in less polarizing ways, which I would argue is actually more makes your activism and your goal seeking more effective. Which I think in a lot of people's minds they see it as opposed, right? But I
Right.
see the more effective and persuasive activism as aligned with the goals of bringing down toxic polarization and contempt. Yeah,
Yeah. I mean, you know this. I completely agree. I think, the way I kind of came into this, because there is our what we do doesn't totally overlap, but we're working towards the same goal, or running on parallel tracks, however you want to put it.
for sure.
And for me, I came to it as coming from a legal background, and then my dad was a lawyer, so maybe you could argue that I kind of had a little bit of that mindset growing up, but it came from this idea that people were not effectively changing minds. It's like people on the left. It's like you see Trump come along, and it's like, okay, obviously he's terrible, and obviously anyone that believes in him is just making a terrible, dumb decision. And now I'm going to tell them that he is terrible and dumb, and you are terrible and dumb for supporting him, and then you will not support him anymore. And then
Right.
Hillary Clinton will be president of the year, or whatever. We'll impeach him. And in practice, that really didn't work. And then you flip it, and it's like, okay, if I, explain to my friends that Hillary Clinton or Barack Obama, or pick your favorite Democrat, is a socialist, Marxist, evil, has maybe trafficked some children, or is doing something, really awful, or is pursuing these programs that are completely antithetical to American values. Like, if I just say that and note that if you support these people, you hate America, like, you will stop hating America, and you will come back onto my my side. And in practice, that's just really not how it works. And so,
Hmm.
like, I really started to think, it's like, okay, so how would you talk to someone if your goal, if you didn't care as much about feeling right and morally justified in the moment, if you actually wanted to talk them into your point of view?
Hmm.
And
Hmm.
that, the way you'd go about that, I think is very different from the way people generally do.
Right.
And so before we go on though, I you have your path into this was pretty interesting, I think. Because the way you talk, you talk about being in this space, you know all the vocab, you know everything. It sounds like you're coming at this from a psychologist background, or some sort of social scientist background. And I don't think that's exactly right.
Mm. Yeah, you want me to explain the
Yeah.
how I got into it?
Yes, I do.
Yeah. I mean, it's definitely an interest in psychology, but yeah, it was how I initially got into it was, like a lot of people, I was angry and in disbelief when Trump got elected, and so I was lashing out on social media a lot. I was issuing a
Smart.
lot of
Yeah.
insults. I was
Yeah.
doing the very thing that I talk about Now that's, so unhelpful. I was saying things like, "Oh, if you voted for Trump, it represents a clear, failure of a moral test." These kinds of insulting,
Yeah.
righteous and arrogant statements and such.
Yeah.
And so, I was driving people I knew away. Like, I would get in fights, as so many people
Mm,
do these days, getting in fights with people I know online and such, and ruining some relationships. But I was so angry. I was like, "Oh, I'm willing to ruin relationships because I'm so righteous, and I'm so right, and
right.
I'm so morally in the right." Uh, but then, I got interested. I've always been interested in psychology, and I started a psychology slash behavior podcast in, I think it was 2017, maybe 2018, but it was supposed to be a focus on more like reading behavior because I came from the poker tells. I used to play poker for a living and wrote some poker tells behavior books. So it was supposed to
Yeah.
be kind of just a way into talking about behavior and physical behavior and verbal behavior. But as I got interested in the political conflict, I started being like, well, what's this polarization people are talking about? And started going down the rabbit hole of conflict dynamics, basically. And so that led me to interview people for the podcast that had written about polarization, including how polarization plays out in other countries and psychological underpinnings. I talked to an author who had written about political insults and the role of insults and hurt feelings and big conflicts. So yeah, just delving into these things, and it was mainly an interest in psychology, but it was also just a practical sense of, like, the more I delved into it, the more this just seemed like a fundamental human problem, like the
Mm,
core human problem, our tendency to get into these toxic conflicts, which continually escalate. And that just seemed to me like a core human problem that somehow we have to overcome, or we're not going to exist very long as a species. Like, I'm pretty pessimistic on that front. I feel like we're just going to destroy ourselves with bigger and bigger weapons. As
uh-huh.
more powerful weapons come out, all it takes is like one person who has an us versus them, team
Mm,
based mentality to be like, I'm willing to burn it all down, because of my animosity and my moral
right.
outrage or whatever. So I see it as the core human problem, and that's kind of what motivates me. Is I just don't think enough people are talking about it. I'm just kind of shocked that so many people know about all these conflict dynamics things and how they play out in so many similar ways, and yet we don't barely talk about it as a society. We just don't even. I mean, as far as I'm concerned, we just completely ignore it as a society, and as politicians and as journalists and pundits and educators, we just are really ignorant about conflict dynamics, I think.
Yeah, that is really interesting, and I mean, that's another reason kinda why I started writing. It's like you really don't see a lot of what we try to do if you just read the newspaper, or you watch the news. You do see a lot of, um where people, they're focused on explaining just why you're wrong, and then
Yeah,
if you don't get it at first, they'll just kinda repeat it, and it's just constantly, from their perspective, it's like, here are the facts, and it's often gonna be some subset of the facts, and then based on those facts, which we're saying are the only salient facts, you obviously have to reach X conclusion,
right.
and then if you don't, it's like, that is, you're dumb, or, something like that,
There,
and then
there, there's a focus on truth finding as opposed
right.
to recognizing that it's very easy for us to reach different versions of the truth, right? Yeah,
Right. Right.
yeah,
Yeah. Very easy, very different reasons of the truth. And it's, yeah, a couple other things that kind of guided me on my own path to this. Was one, having, you're talking about relationships that you were, kind of willing to sacrifice in your post Trump anger. It's like, I, this whole time, have had very close relations, family and friends, uh, people that don't believe what I believe politically. We're on opposite sides of issues, and you can take that a couple of different ways. You can make that, kind of this moral test. You can apply a moral test and end those relationships. Certainly, a lot of people have done that. Or you can decide that you're just going to ignore all talk about politics. Some people do that too, and you just kind of have this kind of uncomfortable elephant in the
yeah.
room that you try not
Firewall
to.
the
Yeah.
yeah,
And then there's a third option, which I think is a lot more interesting, where this can be like a mutual thing where you're both trying to do this, where you're both uh, on two sides of it. You're trying to find out why the other people believe what they believe, which I think is it's. I tend to think it's like people generally think they're reasonable and they think
Mhm.
they're making a good choice. It's not like people, certainly large factions of people, they're not choosing a political candidate because they're like, you know what, I am an unreasonable person and I desire evil for my countrymen or for whoever else. And so I am going to support this candidate. It's like that's not what is happening in their brains. And so if you want to talk them out of what they're doing, it seems like a necessary predicate to figure out why they believe what they believe in the first place, why they
Mhm.
vote the way they do, why they do what they do. And yeah, for me, so part of it really grew out of that.
Yeah.
And then the second part I forgot. But the
Yeah. No, it is, yeah, there is just so much focus on being right and explaining to other people, and I just think we need a
Mm,
new way of thinking about, if we're going to do well as a country or as a species, even, I think we just need more people recognizing and talking about, how these conflicts play out, and I think
mhm.
that's what I see as you and I contributing to. It's like getting people to think about that more, and recognizing, uh, yeah, just how easy it is for us to wind up on either side of these, these divergent narratives, basically.
And
Yeah.
well, and the funny thing, you talk about both of us working on this. It's like neither of us has a huge following as of yet.
Yeah.
Um, we would be. I think we're open to huge followings. Um, very lucrative, huge followings. I think I personally am open to that.
Yeah.
And it's funny that that what like writing and talking that actively seeks to tamp down exciting rhetoric and all that, it doesn't get the people going in the same way
No.
that inflammatory rhetoric and messages uh, do. And
Yeah.
yeah, I don't really know
Well,
what
I
to
was
do
gonna
about
add,
that.
yeah, one thing I was gonna add in there, when it comes to, there is a fundamental, human psychology, reason why people don't want to talk about these things. So, and I think oftentimes we view it in terms of like, oh, the media has incentives to,
Mm,
rile us up or polarize us or whatever. But there's a very real human thing, media people, journalists, politicians are all humans too, and they have true beliefs and they have real fears of like helping
right.
the other side and such. So there's a fundamental aspect in terms of like even talking about the idea of polarization, and the way we talk about it implies acknowledging that, both sides have played a role and play a role.
Yeah.
So,
Right.
but for many people, who are politically passionate people, who are journalists or in the media, in politics, even to talk about that idea, regardless of, as you and I say, I think you say also, you can fully be behind this work even while seeing the quote other side is worse or more toxic. That shouldn't get in the way of you embracing these ideas. But I think for a lot of people, they, even by talking about the problem of conflict dynamics or polarization dynamics, that's acknowledging that, our side has something to work on, which a lot of people just don't want to do because they're afraid
Right.
of getting pushback to that idea. We see that a lot. They'll get pushback from their allies. They're afraid of being seen as naive, because it's all the other side's fault, or mostly the other side's fault in their
Yeah.
mind or their allies' minds. So there's just various human ways, the same ways that these things affect everyday citizens, their behavior. These things are affecting the behaviors of politicians and media people in the media, educators. So it's
Yeah.
just, I think, seeing the very human aspect of how that plays out, where even talking about resolving a conflict, that conflict makes the very act of doing that harder, right? Because in a very human way. And I think
Yeah.
that seeing that, it helps explain why we just don't talk about it as a society.
That is really, yeah, we end up kind of in this trap. The another way to think about it, it's like you can only persuade people that listen to you. If someone doesn't hear what you say, you end up as the proverbial tree falling in a forest far away from anyone. And I
I
think
feel
about
that way
that.
sometimes.
Yeah. Yeah. And, yeah, I think, I both have an idea of what that
I
you've
am the
spent a lot of
tree. That's a good Zen koan. I should build something around, like, I am the tree falling in the forest, and
I
no
am
one
the
moves me.
tree. Yeah, to do this, you kinda have to be okay being the tree, that falls. But it's like, you even look at, the big media companies. You can use them as an example, but this is very true for individuals too, just how we talk with friends and family. But once, and these things all happen, whether you want to attribute it to, to kind of perverse incentives on the media, or as you're talking, like these just very real human instincts and concerns, um, different news stations tend to take a particular political line, and they do that. And that has a number of follow-on effects, but one of them is that people on the other side tend to stop listening. So let's
Mhm,
say that, MSNBC, they for a certain period of time have pursued a reliably pro-democratic, pro-progressive, uh, you know, collection of messages, and over that period of doing that, everyone that doesn't believe those messages has stopped listening. They just don't watch
mhm,
MSNBC, and, if someone clips MSNBC on Twitter or whatever, like, they're not watching that either. And then
mhm,
let's say that MSNBC is like, "You know what? We made a mistake," or maybe we didn't make a mistake, but now we've got this really good point, and they come out with something that's legitimately great, like where it's well argued. And if a conservative, listened to it and got all this, like, you know what, that's really good. You addressed all my concerns, and now I am persuaded, or I'm open minded to whatever you just said. That only works if they're still listening.
right,
If they're not listening, then then all you're doing is, broadcasting to the people that are already fully on board with you this message where they're like, "Man, that is really good. It is mystifying that the Republicans don't believe this or conservatives don't believe this." It's like they didn't even hear it. I feel
right,
like that with
right,
the New York Times a lot. There's this discussion around the elections. There was this last round, with the Washington Post and LA Times, Bezos and then the owner of the I forget his name, but the owner of the LA Times. They're both billionaires, and Bezos gets a gajillionaire. They're pulling, the editorial board's endorsements of Kamala Harris, and people are seeing this. It's like, man, this is a mistake. Like, you are, you know, uh, you're giving Trump a leg up here. Like, that this matters. And I think the counter to that is it it doesn't matter at all. Like, anyone that was going to be persuaded by the Washington Post's or the LA Times editorial was already persuaded. Like,
mhm,
they're already on
mhm.
board.
Yeah,
There was, yeah.
totally, yeah. I often say that, I'm like, you have to remember that most people know where they stand on, these things, and I see, so many people are venting on social media as if, they're gonna change minds basically about Trump, or whatever it is, and it's
Yeah.
like you gotta think about where you spend your time, because a lot of, there's a yeah, a lot of people's minds are just made up about an assortment of things these days. Yeah.
Yeah. And to make sure I'm not just picking on the left, I spend because of how I'm trying to write it, I spend a fair amount of time circling around, the Federalist and Breitbart and various other, um, very, very consistently conservative news sites and things, like that. That is really helpful if you're trying to get insight into what, populist conservatives are thinking about and the way that they look at things. But if you were to just take an article and send it to, to a liberal, to a regular reader of the New York Times or whatever, it's like, it's just not going to work at all. It's the same
Right.
sort of thing. It's just not crafted for that audience. It doesn't use its
Yeah.
language. It's
The
just,
narratives are too the narratives and the lingo are too divergent. It's like trying to understand, to get,
yeah.
because I spent years trying to understand what was driving people to be enthusiastic about Trump. That took me quite a while, and I feel like I understand it. And I empathize with a lot of those views now. But like, to just jump into something, it can be very, that's nearly impossible for people on both sides of the divergent narratives to understand what's driving, all these concerns and stuff. Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah. The so you what you focus on in your book, that there is you do run through a number of issues, like what Republicans think about it, what Democrats think about it, but much of what you write is focused not on specific subjects so much as on depolarization techniques and how to think
Mhm.
about that. And then you take that guide and like you write that so people have this guide to apply then to the individual subjects, their own conflicts.
Right.
And so there were a couple of things that I wanted to kind of walk through with you that you've written. We're going to get to the 8 tips for activists in a minute. Is that your most popular article on Substack?
That might have been. Now that you mention it, I don't know, but yeah, it was definitely up there. Yeah, it got
Definitely up
kind
there.
of went semi-viral for my rating anyway.
There was a before, and we'll get to that because it has these 8 tips that I think are interesting to walk through. But before we get to that, you also in another article I noted you literally made a vocabulary guide, a guidance on polarizing language, and I have this open. Can you explain what your thinking was in putting this together, where you have different words and then kind of how they're looked at by different sides, different people?
Yeah, I initially made it for it was meant to be how I thought of things, and it was meant to be for people in like the depolarization bridge building space because I saw even in that space ways people were using language I thought in bad ways, or
Mm,
not bad necessarily, but just unintentionally divisive, unintentionally driving people away. So, in the interest of helping people in the bridge building slash depolarization space, and it was specifically, I had put some of it together on my own for something, but then I was also helping that organization, Builders, formerly known as Starts With Us,
yeah.
and I had shared I was putting some of that guidance together for them too. For example, they were using the word misinformation, and I thought for various reasons that it was not a good word to use because it had
What about that word
associations.
specifically? Yeah.
Well,
Yeah,
yeah,
just as an example. Yeah.
and I should say, yeah, as an example, that word has liberal associated connotations because it's so often used in liberal leaning op eds and pieces, and so conservatives, Republicans can associate that with like attempts to cast too broad a net on what is misinformation and call some reasonable stances and views misinformation. So it can just be just by the way that different populations use different words, those words can take on connotations and associations. So it's much and I think it was Vanessa Otero at Adfontes Media, which is a media bias company. When I interviewed her, I asked her about that too because she had a similar guidance of avoiding that word for the same reasons. So
Yeah.
just to say, yeah, there's all these words that can be associated with one group or another. So you have to be aware of those perceptions if you don't want to drive people away. And another example that Isaac Saul talked about in his TED talk was talking about the perceptions of illegal immigrants or
Mm,
illegal aliens, say that word versus undocumented immigrants, and these the various perceptions and ways that groups will use words as
yeah.
ways to communicate their principles or ideas, and then the very negative perceptions they can have of the other side's use of the words and all these things. So to
Yeah.
me, I created that guide um, just to it was mainly to help bridge building and depolarizing aimed people, but then obviously it also helps people who are just trying to communicate in less polarizing ways. And I think it's mainly
Mhm.
just about being aware of the perceptions. It doesn't mean you can't use those various words, but it just means being aware of possible landmines and such.
Yeah, that is interesting. The one about undocumented migrants or illegal aliens, it's an interesting one because the minute you hear someone use one of those terms, you have already extrapolated out a ton of
Right,
different beliefs for them. And
right,
now, and depending on where you're coming from, that means either, okay, you're about to pay attention more closely, you're about to take them seriously, or you're about to reject everything they say out of hand, or you can. You've given
right,
yourself this out. And yeah,
right.
and with misinformation, it's a funny one. It's funny how these things happen where like misinformation is associated with used a bit more on the left, and then also where, when people on the right hear misinformation, that they can just dismiss it. And
Mhm.
it's, like there are organic ways that these things happen. Like,
Mhm.
take for example, the COVID lab leak theory, which for a period was cast as solely misinformation. And that message was pushed really hard, um, by the mainstream media, by the government, mostly by people that we would associate with not Trump Republicans.
Mhm.
And then, now with a bit, we have some more information a few years down the road, and it's like, I don't know if that was all misinformation.
Right, it was never something that should have been off limits as a discussion point, right? I think
Right.
that's the thing, and so but the associations that grow when one side is using a word to kind of denigrate the other side's beliefs, yeah, it makes sense that misinformation would grow to have those associations, and
Yeah.
it kind of fits in with a, a general trend of like liberal leaning people using these kind of academic words which
Mm.
sound too fancy, and it's like it's just as easy to say we think that was false, or we think this is a contested
Yeah.
idea, or this is
Yeah.
inaccurate for xyz reasons. It's like you don't have to reach for these kind of fancy words to say basic ideas, right?
Yeah. Well, yeah. I mean, and you end up the reason for the fancy word, you say misinformation, so you don't have to engage with it. Like
Right.
if you're
And
saying
it's kind
it's
of like conspiracy theories, which gets,
yeah,
that's another thing that can have a liberal leaning association because people can perceive too broad a brush being painted for like what's misinformation or what's conspiracy theories or all these things. Yeah.
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 And so actually, one more thing before we run through these 8 points, and it's funny, like part of the reason for us to talk more about what the left is doing wrong is that, like, that's the side we vote for. This is not us coming on here to say, like, Trump is, I think people on the right would be very comfortable admitting he is a fairly inflammatory person. And his, the White House official account has posted a number of inflammatory things. Some of
Real
them,
troll like, yeah, very troll like.
yeah, very,
Yeah.
very troll like. So,
Yeah.
some of them kind of funny, some of them I think a good deal less so. Um, certainly to me, the liberal, I think they're less funny and less appropriate. I But, like, kind of to the biblical advice of, taking the mote out of or the beam out of your own eye before you take the mote, even if it is a beam, or, like a double beam or whatever. Like, it things just work a little bit better if it, you have to make the corrections on your own side. It's much easier to make the corrections on your own side than on the other. I wanted to just ask you about an op-ed you wrote in the Deseret News, and I asked because that's a Salt Lake paper, where I'm talking to you from right now. You wrote
Mhm.
about Biden because I think, like, everyone, certainly everyone on the left knows, and I think most people on the right know about Trump's divisiveness. But
Mhm.
a lot of people on the left don't really understand why Biden was seen that way by Republicans.
Right.
And I was wondering if
Yeah.
you could talk through a couple of examples.
Well, yeah, I think it's important at a fundamental level to just see that groups in a conflict are always very different, right? They have different there's different traits, for example, we kind of have like with between the Republican and Democrat groups, we have various asymmetries, of working class versus more,
Mm,
educated. We have, the fact that liberal people dominate, liberal ideas dominate in these core cultural institutions like education and media and news media, entertainment media,
mhm,
these various areas, which can, help. Some of these asymmetries can help explain why the groups can behave in very different ways. For example, like the animosity and contempt towards the other side will play out in different ways between the groups because they have different traits in general. So, if you think that if you can see that Republicans can feel that they're the underdogs, which might make them more okay with more aggressive
mm,
language from Trump, it's some of these asymmetries help explain why these things play out in different ways and why one group does things the other doesn't do. For example, conservatives might say, yeah, we don't have people on our side in college, conservative college people who are shouting down people and chasing them off the campus and these kinds of things, right? So there's things that both groups do and the way that things play out because of the asymmetries of the group. So I think seeing that is important because it helps explain, because both groups are filtering for the things that the other side does that their group doesn't do, the bad things, and that helps them
Yeah.
make the case this is all their fault because all these bad things that they do that our group doesn't do, right? So I
Right.
think I think
Right.
seeing that is important because it helps explain, it helps people see the complexity of the conflict, and it helps people see how they might just be filtering for the causes of offense in various ways. So yeah, even
Hmm.
even many Trump voters I've talked to, I think a majority of Trump voters will say, when asked, yes, I think Trump is divisive, and that is one thing I don't. Many of them will say that is one thing I don't like about them. Many other people who are more enthusiastic about him might say that's what I like about him. But I think a
Hmm.
lot of people will acknowledge that he's divisive in various ways. But they're mainly filtering for the offenses that they see on the other side, right? And that's how conflict works. We're
Yeah.
filtering for the threats, the insults, the bad ideas of the other side. And that allows us to, if we're focused on that, that allows us to justify, even if we view people on our side as problematic in various ways, we can justify it because we're focused on the threats and the insults and the dangers on the other side. So I think, to your question about Biden, the things I wrote about, which were I think they're just fundamental ways that conflict makes people behave. And I think a factor in Biden's behavior is I think he was, cognitively declined. I think if he was a little sharper, I don't think he would have behaved in some of those ways and said some of those things. For example, the well-known one of saying, whatever it was, like, uh if you vote for Trump, you ain't black, or something like this. It was just kind of this. That was a good manifestation of this kind of team-based way of thinking about our divides, right? A very
Yeah.
simplistic and I would say one of the worst, one of the worst political, strategic things I've ever heard from somebody who I think up until that point, for most of his career, was a pretty politically savvy person. But I think
Mm.
him saying these kinds of things, which were manifestations of the simplistic way that he was viewing our divides, and I think a simplistic way that many people view our divides as these kind of like clean delineations of,
Yeah.
who's with us and who's against us. But I think he wouldn't have said that if he was a little cognitively sharper. Like, I think he was kind of like going down this rabbit hole of thinking in very simplistic us versus them ways about our divides, and filtering for worst case interpretations of what support for Trump meant, or what the various things that Trump said and did, what those things meant. And that I saw as just a fundamental way that uh, toxic conflict, toxic conflict brings those things out of us and makes us think in these kind of simplistic us versus them ways, and then we speak
Yeah.
in those ways, and we amplify the other side's anger because we speak in those ways. So it's a self-reinforcing thing. But yeah, I think I wrote that piece because I wanted people to see that even if you think, Trump is much worse on the divisive aspect, it's worth seeing how there's major flaws in how Democrat leaders have behaved, and some of the ways they've spoken, behaved, have amplified the conflict, or at least done very little to reduce it. I would say they've
Yeah.
they've amplified, a good number of things they've said and done have not added to the toxicity of the conflict. And I think you can see that aspect even if you largely agree with, or totally agree
Yeah.
with them, because it's about seeing how we engage and separating that from what we believe. Yeah.
Yeah, it's fun. It's very easy to see the other side as a monolith and your
Mhm.
side as this kind of diverse coalition where, like, you admit, like, there are people that are doing things you wouldn't agree with, but that's only part of it. It's like it's you can't really look at them because they shouldn't represent the whole. We don't agree with him, but then the other side,
Right.
they are actually a monolith and they are collectively guilty for the acts of a few. Let's um let's walk through these 8 points. I think they're kinda interested. Would like to walk through 'em one by one. And so this was an article you wrote. Okay, this is, and Tell me a little bit about the article and what kind of like what you were thinking about when you wrote this, because this was a month ago now, I think. About.
Yeah, I was actually motivated to. It was kind of a spur of the moment thing because I was appearing on this outrage overload podcast. He was doing a kind of a panel about how people should approach their activism and their outrage, while thinking about polarization.
Hmm.
In preparation for that, because I knew I would have to talk about those things, and I was kind of nervous about it. I just thought I'd work through some of the things that I think about
Mm,
activism and polarization. I didn't
yeah.
think it would be that popular, but it was interesting that it kind of took off a bit, which I think speaks to there is a demand, I think, on both sides for how
Yeah.
you can pursue your activism in less toxic ways. So yeah, that was kind of what led up to it. It was basically me being like, I got to really be able to talk about this stuff a little bit better in a live format. So yeah,
So that's funny, and I also want to make sure after we get through these, I also want to make sure that we talk a little bit about the comments to it, because I read through the comments to the article, and it's funny because some people I think really get it and they see where you're coming from, and then some other people it does seem like it's like, okay, I see what you're saying, and normally I'd agree with you, but you don't get it. These
right,
guys are just
right.
that bad, and it's like,
Yeah.
nah, okay,
Which which I understand. Like I get that a lot. I mean, that's
yeah,
how what
sure,
I've always gotten, it's it's also the same things that people were saying ever since Trump was elected. So
right.
we have people, but yeah, we can get into the comments after we yeah.
So let's say, so number one is ask yourself if you're really trying to persuade or just vent your anger. That I think that is great. And this is not just in the political context. This is great. Like again, like all of this stuff, political conversations. It applies to all conversations. If you're in a dispute with someone, might be something family related, friend, whatever it is. It's like that's a good question to ask yourself. So how did you come up with that, and why was that your first one?
Yeah, I kind of saw that as the foundational aspect of I just see so many people venting online, especially. I do believe social media has, the internet age has amplified our toxic divides, our tendency to engage in that. So I just see that as kind of like the kindling, the social kindling for all the anger that happens. We're always riling each other up online, and it's also what people think about if we're talking about how politically passionate people are thinking. They're thinking about how am I spending my time? What am I doing with my time? And a lot of people are spending time, doom scrolling and posting on social media. So I think it's important to just think at a foundational level, like how are we spending our time and what is it actually doing?
That's interesting. I was just thinking, is in a number of conversations with friends and family, like you will vent or someone will vent to you, and it's venting, and you just you vent, and then it's done and you're fine, and then you move on and the conversation's over. No one recorded it, and like it's not really doing it, like it's just this, you're just unburdening yourself. But
Mhm.
then when you do the same thing online, like
Right.
that is there for the world to see, and what often begins is with is kindling, it turns into this conflagration, it is giant bonfire where um it's like where people are venting at each other instead of
Mhm.
just like venting to a close friend or whatever. um
Right. Right. Very different. Yeah.
yeah. So number two is ask yourself how you'd feel if they did it.
Mm.
That
Want me
kind
to
of
talk
a
about that?
Yeah, kind of a golden rule
Uh,
sort of thing.
Sorry, I think there was a delay. I think I
Oh,
maybe
sorry.
cut you off.
No, no, go ahead.
Oh yeah. So yeah, the I put that second because I also think that's a foundational aspect of, and it's how I approach so many of these things is trying to imagine what Philip Tetlock called the turnabout test, which is just trying to take the people involved in a conflict and reversing the roles and imagining how you'd feel about it in an equivalent way.
Mhm.
So that helps people see how their approaches might, if like a liberal protester or activist, imagine the language they're using, and then imagining a Trump supporter activist using that same language, like if it's highly insulting or
Yeah.
highly worst case, highly pessimistic, it kind of helps you see like, oh, I'm not actually trying to persuade anyone. I'm just kind of venting my frustrations, and I'm driving people away and these kinds of things. So yeah,
Yeah. That it's funny, the example you use, and I'll, uh, make the language a little more family appropriate, but, like, signs, the idea of someone going to a protest with a "Screw Elon Musk" sign. It's like, it might be kind of fun to write that out, fun to go to the protest, you got it, you're shaking. But then you imagine, like, if you saw a protest where someone had a "Screw Joe Biden" or a "Screw," and maybe Biden, Biden right now is not the high point of his, I don't know, public popularity, but, a "Screw somebody you like, you see that, and that is not that doesn't persuade you to reconsider your views of that person or of that thing. Like, you don't see, screw Bernie Sanders and think, "Oh gosh, before I had really liked him, but now, like, there must be some deeper reason that they're saying screw him, and I should really look into this." No, it's like you just have immediately dismissed this person and think, this person's, dumb or what, whatever.
yeah. You think they're bad people? Like
Yeah.
that confirms for you that they're crass and
Yeah.
motivated by hatred, and
Right.
therefore I'm completely right in being against these people because look at how hateful they are.
Yeah, that don't even need to engage.
Yeah,
And
yeah.
then yeah, yeah. Number 3, and I like this one. So don't insult the entire other side. Would you
Yeah,
mind,
that's
walk me through that?
yeah, that's I mean that's kind of like the low-hanging fruit I think of when it comes to what I view as depolarization work is like even if activists and leaders only did the bare minimum, the low bar of avoiding insulting the entire other group, other political group. Even if you did that, even if like major politicians and pundits cut that out of their that low hanging fruit out of
Yeah.
their efforts, I think that would we'd see a pretty huge improvement just from that alone, and that's why I consider that kind of like the low hanging fruit for anyone interested in depolarization work, whether they're activists or journalists or pundits or whatever. Just try to avoid assigning, you know, malicious intent to the whole other group. And
Mm,
there's various indirect ways that can happen too. I think because sometimes, you know, us saying that somebody on the other side has malicious motivations for believing XYZ can be
mm,
interpreted as the other side as a whole having malicious motivations. But I think just being aware of the perceptions that alone would go so far. I think if more people, and I'm just always kind of amazed that people I expect more from, in terms of leaders or pundits, are often speaking about the entire other side in conflict amplifying ways and insulting, arrogant ways and such. Yeah.
yeah. It just really doesn't it doesn't help as a means or an end. Like, it does not help you get to where you're trying to go.
Hmm.
Um, okay, number 4, be hard on issues, soft on people.
Hmm. Yeah, this was kind of a if people have heard that before, it's often in like I've seen it in business coaching and negotiation kind of things, but it's also a conflict resolution principle. It's just when you're angry and judgmental of some people politically or otherwise, it pays to talk about the ideas as opposed to talking about the badness of the people, right? And that's another pretty low bar I think too, because so often you know politicians or activists, pundits are focusing on the badness of the people. And it's like you make a much more persuasive, less polarizing case by talking about here's why these ideas are bad, here's why they're bad for you,
Yeah.
and so there's ways to talk about things that don't bring the people as much into it, which I think is the key to activists speaking in equally persuasive ways, and but ways that don't rile up more contempt and anger and such.
Yeah. The yeah, it's interesting. Number of thoughts come to mind here, but I Oscar Wilde in this is gonna sound is okay, so I'll say this because it's about to sound very douchey. But I majored in English and my senior thesis was on Oscar Wilde. So this is why this is always top of mind. But Oscar Wilde, he wrote in De Profundis, he was talking about the Oxford manner of playing gracefully with ideas. And I've always really liked that, and you can talk about that in the, educational environment. You want to be able to toss around these ideas and talk about it, but it's also like just good functional advice. If you're talking to someone and let's say that you are, you're a conservative and you want to persuade a liberal that a more restrictive immigration policy is going to be better. If you start with talking about like if your focus is on how it's anti-American to support a policy that allows too many people to come in or something, it's like that pretty quickly that's not a graceful way to do it. That you have pretty quickly turned a political discussion into an insult of the person that holds these views. Whereas
Right.
if you're really just focused on the ramifications of a certain policy, uh, like at the policy level, that's different. It's easier to swallow. And
Right.
from saying this from years of conversation with people, uh, both on the right and the left about ideas that are very difficult to talk about in public, without, in full comfort. Like you're really being careful about your language. It's like people, if you can establish a relationship with someone where you can really just talk about the ideas and they know you're not attacking them, it's
Hmm.
it's amazing both how what you can talk about and with what degree of comfort, and then also how quickly and effectively you can reach some sort of agreed upon solution, or you can
Hmm.
at least, yeah, you can find the common ground and then really hone in on what you don't have in common. Um,
Yeah.
yeah,
Well, and I would say too, I would apply this, like if I say I was debating Donald Trump in a presidential debate,
yeah,
I think I would take, I think this is seeing this difference is what allows you to take what I see as both depolarizing, de-escalating, and more persuasive approaches. Because I would be like, you know, Donald, I'm sure I know that you want to help America and you fully believe and that these things are good, but here's why I disagree, and that has several effects. It prevents, it kind of takes the wind out of the sails of it de-escalates and moves away from personal insults, and it acknowledges the better motivations that you're disagreeing with on the other side. And I think some people would think like, oh, if you did that with Trump, that would be so naive, he would just insult you. And I'm like, I actually think no, actually think Trump has shown in many examples that he can be de-escalated with, a little bit of flattery and acknowledgement that he is trying to do something good. I've seen that many times. And I
mm,
think people that act as if the other side or our opponents are so bad you can't take those approaches. I just think I would say like those approaches have pretty scarcely been tried. They're like so rare as to be non-existent. So to try
yeah,
to write that off as like some sort of failed approach is silly to me because no one basically does it, right? So
yeah. Well, and then also, yeah, you're saying no one does it. But also, it's like, what are you trying to do? It's like,
right.
are you trying to I remember having this conversation with someone close to me in a very different context a few years ago, where it's like sometimes you need to lose battles to win wars. You need to lose, especially moral battles. You don't need, if you can give up the need to feel right all the time or
Mm,
to win every single little interaction, you can you can win in the long run. And if your goal with Trump, in this hypothetical situation where Trump is going for a third term and Zach Elwood is the Democrat, you're the Democratic flag bearer, to be
that'd be a
man,
hell of a
uh,
turn for the country. I
stranger than fiction
probably
in a number of ways.
yeah, pretty unlikely probably, but
Probably,
yeah.
you never know. But, in that unlikely situation, like, if your goal is just to, feel like you've properly told Trump that he's bad, or, or
Right.
whatever, it's like, you're sacrificing long-term gain for a short-term one.
Yeah, and I'd be, if I was in that situation, I think more people, yeah, one of the things yeah, it's actually one of my things in the piece is like, I'd be focusing more on people listening than I would on Trump. I don't care what
Sure.
Trump thinks. My engagement with Trump is just to try to talk to people in the audience, right? So don't get drawn into these, insult laden things. Yeah.
So that's interesting. Okay, so I remember this from your piece, and this I look at this a couple of different ways. So, because this is one of those situations where I think there are different people that need different advice. So if you go into a debate and so I remember basically I'm thinking of this because on a number of these jubilee debate things, like they'll uh, don't know if you're familiar, but they'll take one person with a some strongly held view, and they'll put them in the middle of a room, and then they'll surround them with like 20, you know, counter debaters, or whatever you call them.
I don't know this. Yeah.
Okay, a number of people have done it. Ben Shapiro,
Wait,
Sam
who are they
Cedar,
surrounded by? Are they surrounded by just
people that
people
disagree
asking
with
them
them.
questions? Oh, disagree. Wow. Okay.
And then
Jeez.
they'll like, they'll like tap in, and they'll go and they'll sit in the chair across from them there in the middle, and then they'll debate them about something, and then the star of the show or whatever will either win or lose or whatever, and then they'll reach a stopping point, and someone else will tap in and come, and so you just debate, 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 and it makes for great for some people, I should say, because I it's to me, it's not my jam, but for
It's
a
like
lot of people,
wrestling. It's like pro wrestling of debating or something.
yeah, it's like
Okay.
for some people, it's great entertainment, and you end up with a lot of great social media clips where it's like, look at, Democratic activist Dean Withers, and he's just owning all these Trump voters,
Right.
and then it's
Right.
like, I don't think he changed anyone's mind, but
Right.
congratulations.
Both
And
sides can own each other at different times, right?
just
Owning each other is easy depending on the context and the
right.
situation. Yeah.
Right. But I've thought about what I would do, because I think, and I think I might have seen Ben Shapiro say this somewhere too. Obviously Ben Shapiro, this incredibly articulate, um, a conservative, Daily Wire guy who to some people is very persuasive and to others is um, obnoxious and off-putting. And it turns out there are a lot of people that can be described with both of those terms.
Right.
But one risk, it really just depends on the insult. It's like one risk of focusing just on the person in front of you is if you get into kind of a conflict heavy dialogue with them and you end up being really insulting, then you might not just insult them, but insult everyone that agrees with them.
Right. Right.
But then the risk of just focus, and I think actually Dean Withers might have been the one that said this, the risk of just focusing on the people that are not there is that it can free you up. For some people, the way that functions is it frees them up to be insulting towards the person in front of them because they don't really care about that person. They don't care
Hmm.
about their feelings. And
Interesting.
so d- different paths for different people, I think what where you want them to end up is uh, basically, I think the point is the depolarization approach, depolarizing approach, the conflict reducing approach is going to make you more persuasive, not just to the person in front of you, but also to the people listening.
Right. I think it's a factor of just asking yourself, am I trying to be persuasive or not? Because I think a conflict just leads to people not caring about being persuasive in a lot of ways. It's they're
Yeah,
mainly trying to speak to people on their side for the most part. But I think, yeah, it really depends on how persuasive you want to be. And it always boggles my mind, like when elections are so close, why it boggles my mind that when shifting the population, the votes you get by like 1 or 2 or 3% matters so much. Like, why aren't people trying to speak to a little bit more to people in the
right.
middle who might be undecided? That's always boggled my mind. I'm like, I mean, I fully believe, getting back to the activism being aligned with these ideas. It's like if Trump tried to take a slightly more uh more persuasive approach, I think he would have, his votes would increase. I think if
Yeah.
Democrats try to take more persuasive approaches, I think their votes would increase. So I think that's where I see these things as aligned, because even just the act of persuasion is trying to persuade people is a depolarizing act.
It's nuts that people seem to be going into elections where it's like our ceiling, Like our best case scenario is we're getting like 51% of people to vote for us. Like,
Yeah, but it says a lot about the incentives where people, I think a lot of these people may even know that, you know, the best thing to do would be to try to reach more people, but there's so many incentives to like
right.
not be perceived as weak and to speak aggressively, and that leads to people speaking in unnecessarily insulting and polarizing ways. So I think it just speaks to the incentives of like, oh, I'm afraid that somebody on my side in my party is going to call me out for not being hardcore enough and not calling out the other side enough, and so I need
Yeah.
to amp up my aggressions and not care about being as persuasive as I could be. All these kinds of things. I think there's just so many incentives and fundamental human aspects to it. Yeah.
This is a good time for me to shout out if anyone listening, go read my piece against partisan primaries. So
Oh, I need to check that out. Yeah, I
I
need to
think
check out
those
some of your recent pieces.
play into some of the bad incentives there. Okay, number 5, seek to understand and acknowledge opponent views and concerns.
Yeah, I think that's big, especially when it comes to, say currently anti-Trump people trying to, you know, uh, work against Trump or defend democracy, however you want to phrase it. I think it's important if whatever activism work you're doing, you have to recognize that many people see your side as not caring about their concerns. So if you want
Yeah.
to make persuasive arguments, you have to acknowledge like, hey, there were legitimate defensible things that people were concerned about, and not just and I think it was I think I included a quote from Ilana Redstone, who wrote The Certainty Trap, where she was talking about the importance of uh, liberal anti-Trump people acknowledging that there were many people who felt that they were unfairly called racist and bigoted for what were pretty defensible and non-bigoted stances. That they felt that they were treated undemocratically and unfairly. So if you want to work on these things, no matter what the activism is, you have to start with being interested in what has driven people to support the other side and these kinds of things. And getting back to the fundamental point, it's not it's not persuasive to just say these people are bad. It's you have to
Yeah.
be curious about what's if you think even if you think Trump's horrible, if you think Biden's horrible, whoever, you should be curious about what is leading half the country to vote for these people, right?
Yeah, I'm just gonna run through two concrete examples really quickly for both sides. So let's take, like two of the major issues of the moment are uh, immigration or immigration, anti-immigration enforcement, and then tariffs. So if you look at immigration, if you're coming from the left, like, and you want to convince someone on the right, it's like, look at what Trump is doing, shipping people to El Salvador, potentially shipping people to Libya. Like this is an outrage. This is, in violation of these longstanding American principles and like actual law. And clearly this is morally reprehensible, and you should oppose this. And like this should be your red line, and you should be done. But that, like in and of itself, like you kind of have to address, I think, how a Republican would respond, which is that, listen, Trump, like what he's doing, yeah, agreed. It's pretty aggressive, it's all that, but uh, encounters at the border are down precipitously. Like he's actually doing kind of what he intended to do, and he's doing it through sending some very strong signals. The arbitrariness, just the I'm not sure if you want to call it viciousness, or it is the steepness, the sternness, whatever. Um, he's approaching this with a very heavy hand, and it has done pretty much exactly what he was elected to do, or what some people would argue he was elected to do. And then by the
Mhm.
same token, like if you're on the right and you're trying to focus someone on the left on this, that people coming over the border, that's gone, that's now a trickle, where it was a pretty steady river during at least the first 3 years of the Biden administration. It's like you're not going to talk someone into that if you can't address in good faith the fact that we have sent people to El Salvador without any serious due process, and the administration has made mistakes. They've sent people, and we're not just talking about Kilmar Abrego Garcia, but there was the Andre, the makeup artist who is now in prison in El Salvador as an alleged gang member, which seems very unlikely. And there been situations where non-citizens were deported without their citizen children, like young citizen children. Another situation where a 2-year-old citizen, I think, was deported with her non-citizen mother. Like these are things that these are things that a Republican, if you want to talk a Democrat into supporting this, it's like you need to be able to address that.
Yeah,
And
it
then,
reminds me
yeah,
of
sorry.
real quick. It just reminds me of an article by Caitlin Flanagan, I think, about
Mm,
in the on the abortion debate,
mm,
both activists on both sides should want to understand the best versions of the arguments on the other side
yes,
and acknowledge why rational and compassionate people have those views, right? So you don't get you should want to do that for your own sake, right? Yeah,
yeah, yeah, absolutely. And then I wanted to just mention something on the tariffs because I'm writing another article about it right now. But like it is, I think, easy from the Democratic side to say like this is just so dumb and economically destructive, and like this is bad and here for XYZ reasons. But then to make your argument stronger, I think you'd have to note it's like, okay, yes, a number of very large companies have made commitments, not all just since Liberation Day, but have made commitments in part due, and it maybe in part attributable, and certainly arguably because of uh Trump's kind of strong messaging on making things in America. Companies have made trillions of dollars of commitments to expand production in America. And then I think you would also need to address that we are in a situation now where, like, let's say you're fine with low prices, you're fine with manufacturing a ton of stuff overseas, and you actually think that the middle class is doing pretty well in America. Real wages have gone up, and you don't think there's much of a problem there. It is a problem that China controls such a high percentage of really important stuff. Basically, the fact that they have a virtual monopoly on a number of rare earth minerals, it's like that's a problem. The fact that they have such a strong something tending towards monopoly on a number of other um, key elements and inputs, like that's a real problem. The fact that they have used decades of experience that we now haven't gotten to get much better than us at certain kinds of manufacturing, and to build up manufacturing capacity far beyond what we currently have. It's like that's a national security problem. We need to do something to address that.
hmm
And then on the flip side, like if you're a Republican and you're trying to talk people into not just the tariffs, but the way they were implemented,
right.
then I think you need to acknowledge how disruptive this has been, and you need to acknowledge and address how like the disproportionate impact this has, not on the big companies that have Trump's ear, but on the small businesses that do not, that don't really have another option, or certainly don't have other options if you force them to, if you raise their costs in the span of a week rather than in the span of a year or 2 years. And then you have to acknowledge the impact on American consumers. Trump has been talking about, be interesting to see how his messaging changes, but he's been talking about how, you don't need $30. You can get by with two or three. And on, in one sense, that is right. Like if you have $30, like you can probably make do with three people who have done that before. But we're not really concerned about the people that previously had $30. There are a lot of people whose high point was the three. And if costs go up dramatically, it's now they have none. Like and we're talking about dolls, we're talking about discretionary stuff, but there are going to be actual negative impacts on American consumers that probably could have been avoided or minimized had even if you're committed to tariffs, had you gone about it in a different way,
hmm
gone about it a little more gradually.
Well, yeah, and also even just an attempt at persuasion. I mean, the thing that stood out with the tariffs is like in a different world, in a world where Trump wasn't so contemptuous of his opponents, he
Mm,
would try to do more explanations and persuasiveness talks about like, what am I trying to accomplish with this? But
Yeah.
Trump and many other people clearly are at a point where they don't care about persuading other people. It's just like, well, we're going to do this because we can do it, right? And I think
Yeah.
that's kind of the problem with conflict. It leads people to act in these ways where it's just like, well, I'm just going to do it, and if you don't like it, you can deal with it, kind of thing. But
Suck a
it's
lemon.
like,
Yeah.
but it's not that works against your own interest, as we see
Yeah.
with Trump, as we see with other people. It's like, if you actually tried to persuade people, you're doing yourself a favor, and you're lowering anger too by trying to get people to see like, hey, why am I even doing this thing? Like it, but for many people, it's just like they just did it and then like tried to explain it afterwards, and tried
Yeah.
to roll some back or adjust it, or whatever. But yeah, I think that it gets back to that thing of like, yeah, trying to be more persuasive would have been in Trump's best interest, I think, and for all these things, for
Yeah.
everybody, yeah, the alignment of the activism and the pursuing goals and reducing divides. Yeah.
Number 6 here. This is a good one. It's kind of related to that. Use criticisms that come from their side. So what do you mean by that?
Yeah, so I see so many people on both sides trying to, own the other side by either, insulting them directly or criticizing them directly, or using their own allies, like, see
Mm,
what, a liberal person being like, see what Bernie Sanders said about Trump, to understand how bad he is or something. But it's like, because we mostly we're much more likely to listen to people that are similar to us, and our political allies. So, when I was trying to make people uh, see something that I thought was problematic from Trump, something bad from Trump, I would post something from like the National Review or something that was criticizing Trump. I wouldn't post something from the New York Times, right? I would say, "Oh,
yeah.
see what this conservative said about Trump." And, vice versa, I would say the same thing to conservatives. It's not persuasive for you to post something from Breitbart to try to convince, a
Right.
wider audience of your views. You should maybe find a New York Times op-ed that's criticizing,
Yeah.
a more liberal leaning person. So I just think activists should want to do those things to try to try to show, the other auxiliary benefit it has is it shows that our divides are not these like us versus them, black white. It shows the nuance of the fact that we all are not part of monolithic groups. So I think there's an indirect
Mm.
depolarization aspect to these things, where by drawing attention to these non black white, us versus them thinking, it highlights, well, I don't have to think that, I don't have to be black and white in my thinking either. I can disagree with my group and still be on that side largely, or whatever, right?
Yeah. And I would add that there's not always going to be a good option available in terms of taking someone else's criticism and like
Right.
and that's for a couple of reasons. One of which is that there is a lot of pressure right now on people to avoid criticizing their own side,
Right.
and so often that's not going to be there. Uh, and then there's another bit where like sometimes the fact that someone criticizes a side, even if they're on that side, means they are no longer like now they're out. So
Yeah.
thinking about the like the National Review there, it's like there are a number of people to whom National Review that's pretty persuasive, but a lot of Trump Republicans like they've left that
Sure.
like
Sure. Yeah.
because
There's always
National
going to
Review
be
has
those. Yeah, that's
yeah
the thing. As we grow polarized, there's always going to be people that are like, aren't willing to listen to any criticisms, right, on both sides.
yeah
But I think those are relatively small. I think a lot of people are in
yeah
like the majority. But yeah, to your point, it's like, yeah, some people will never want to hear any criticism, no matter who it comes from, right? So
yeah.
yeah.
And I think in those situations sometimes I mean maybe you just give up, but the you I find when I'm trying to do it, it's like if you can get just down to actual facts, like actual raw numbers, and then build criticism based on that. But you start from an agreed upon point, so get to facts that both sides are agreed on. The person person you're arguing with or talking with, however you want to put it, get the facts they agree on. Make sure you start from that agreed upon base, and then build your criticism based on
Mhm.
that.
Hmm.
uh, using someone else's criticism is, kind of a shortcut to that, where you get it to rely on their credibility. If you do it
Mm,
yourself, you have to build your own credibility up.
right,
Um,
right.
so number 7, avoid catastrophizing and worst case framings.
Yeah. So I mean, I think we've seen that a lot from many people. I mean, like in the what stands out to me in the 2022 midterms, you had a lot of liberal people speaking as if Trump's uh, not accepting the election results was a harbinger of all these Republican
Mm,
politicians who were going to deny election results en masse or something, and there was a lot of breathless talk about, oh, this is there's a very good chance this happens, or some people were like, it's going to happen. Um, so that was an example of catastrophizing, and then you had, I think a lot of catastrophizing on both sides, where some people spoke as if liberals really were going to defund all the police departments, or that was like, even if I had my criticisms of that, I always thought that had reached some kind of peak of a polarization in 2021 due to COVID, and that was like the kind of the peak to me. And I thought, oh, we're gonna go move away from some of these extreme things, and it was just because we were pent up from COVID and leading people to catastrophize about
mm,
what the other side's stances meant, and what it meant for the future and these kinds of things. So I think we in conflict, we there's various ways that people will assume the worst about what the other side wants or what's going to happen in the future.
mhm,
For example, people will speak as if they're certain that Trump will never voluntarily leave office even if he loses election. And it's like, no matter what you think of Trump or anyone, it's worth pointing out, or worth thinking about, how speaking confidently as if the worst case scenarios will happen makes other people see you as unreasonable. It makes other people see you as reasoning from emotion, as being just clearly wrong, because nobody knows what the future holds. So the more
mm,
confidently you speak about, what's going to happen in a bad way, it just makes people see you as unreasonable and less willing to be listened to. So I think avoiding the overly catastrophizing, worst case scenario, highly certain narratives. You can still talk about what you're afraid of and
yeah,
concerns and such, but the more you avoid the certain catastrophizing, the more people will be a bit more willing to listen to you and not write you off in like a boy who cried wolf kind of approach. Yeah.
yeah. There's a difference between saying, well, we know for sure, obviously, that Trump isn't going to leave office, no matter what happens in 2028. There's a difference between saying that and, uh, like, you know what, some of the stuff he said, looking at it like that, I think there's legitimate reason to be concerned. Here are my reasons X, Y, and Z, and I'd love to hear your response.
Yeah.
There
There's a big
and
difference there. Yeah.
yeah, and then on immigration, one of the big things was, on the right was like, well, clearly, obviously, Democrats are letting all these people in because they're going to make them all citizens, and then there's never really going to be an actual national election again. Like,
Right.
this is a a nonviolent takeover of the United States through a demographic shift, and like, no, that's that is like, if that's how you start the conversation about, why your concerns about illegal immigration, not going to get all that far. But if you
Right.
start with, here are these other things X, Y, and Z, love to hear your response. It's different.
Yeah, and Elon does that catastrophizing all the
Oh
time.
yeah,
He's always mind reading, like, this is why Democrats are doing this. They're doing it for Z reasons, which is the same thing he hates. Presumably when people do
right,
that to him.
right,
And also, it doesn't even hold water in the sense that, like, even if you thought Democrats were doing that, it's like more and more immigrants are voting Republican. So,
right.
like, from a paranoid perspective, doesn't hold much water. So
I don't know if it. I like to think it's good, but it's certainly funny that both sides have had these, periods where they were convinced that, uh, basically, demographics are destiny,
right,
and
right,
that
right.
is just not really proving to be the case in practice.
Yeah, and I think even, I think Musa Al-Gharbi's paper,
Mm,
Race for the White House, is such an important paper, I think, for understanding that aspect, because, in many in some people's examinations, the reason Trump won in 2016 was, despite uh, you know narratives that it was about on the left, narratives that it was about racism or racial resentment or these kinds of things, or pushback to Obama. uh, a lot of people, there was good analysis that said it was largely about more racial minorities voting Republican, and that could be seen
Hmm.
as one of the, maybe the main cause for Trump winning in 2016. So just to say, yeah, the getting back to these simplistic ideas that many people have about our divides and how they'll play out, and a lot of those can be very catastrophizing in various ways. Yeah.
Yeah. Okay, last one. Number 8, aim your language more at the people who are listening.
Yeah, that was getting back to what we talked about where,
Yeah.
if I was debating Trump, I would be focused on trying to not get dragged into these, insults, and trying to speak to the people listening, which, and then a lot of people listening don't want to hear insults either. They want to hear what, and I want to try to reach the people that are undecided. And so I think,
I
and
just remembered, sorry, Trump Biden. Obviously, the debate was, if you're Biden, was bad for a million reasons. But I was just remembering them talking about
the golf.
golf. Yeah,
Yeah, the golf. Yeah, that was classic. That was just like, I mean,
like,
so many moments in that were kind of such a, it was like watching a train wreck in so many ways. But yeah, the
yeah.
the the random insults thrown back and forth in the golf thing was that was a low point. Uh,
Yeah, the high point of American politics.
yeah,
Yeah,
but yeah, I just think, yeah, and you really got to focus on, when you're debating someone, when you're talking even online. I think, to in a thread, it's like, think more, because seldom will you actually be changing the person's mind that you're talking to in these scenarios. So
yeah,
you should just really think about, well, who's listening, and can I reach some of the people that are a little bit on the fence, or even if I don't reach them, can I at least make them see the rationality of my stances? Like, I think too many people focus on like winning a debate. It's like, well, did you at least help people see that you're not a lunatic or something,
yeah, yeah,
So yeah.
yeah. Man, well, I think we've already gone for an hour and 20 minutes, so maybe we wrap it up in a minute. But one thing we can just end with this is each of us has taken a different approach to this work. As I alluded to at the start, it's like you write about all these, these techniques to depolarize. And then the way I've done it, and I never know if it's working, never know if it's successful, but it's kind of trying to model. Um, I mean, it's a monologue in a sense because it's just me writing, but kind of trying to walk through an issue where we can get, like, someone coming from the right will see where I'm coming from, and note that I have tried to think about where they're coming from.
Mhm.
Someone from the left will have the same experience, and then we can just kind of make some arguments and see if we can come out to some place where we can establish the common ground, and then from that common ground, try to work on the differences.
Mhm.
Yeah,
Yeah,
and
I think,
yeah,
yeah, I would say, yeah, I think you do something similar to what I see Isaac Saul at Tangle News doing. I don't know if you read much of his stuff, because he walks through like, oh, what people on the right are saying, what people on the left are saying, and then gives his take.
yeah,
And I think, yeah, there is. I mean, I see our philosophy as aligned, in the sense that, in my book Diffusing American Anger, a big part of that book was me walking through the issues, to the various contentious issues, to try to help people understand the other side's perspective. And I think that's very important, even as I also feel like there's a lot of like emotion and contempt that are the core problems of these things. But
yeah,
in order to get people to see how that's the case, we have to walk through granular issues and try to understand what's driving, our opponents, our rational, compassionate fellow citizens, to believe these different things. If we can see that for various issues, that kind of starts opening us up to be like, oh, now I can start to see how this too much contempt might be the underlying factor here, and I can start thinking about how I behave and how that, plays a role, and these kinds of things. But yeah, so I see the things as aligned, and I don't think there's, I like you, I'm often uncertain about, there's no right answers to these things. And
yeah,
if there were clearly right answers, people would be able to resolve conflict better in general, like interpersonal conflict or
Yeah.
wars or internal country polarization. Like there's no easy answers because this is just such a hard thing to get out of. But I think you and I are philosophically aligned in that sense. Yeah.
Yeah. Because ultimately, what we're trying to get to, and this is where it becomes, kind of uh, means to an end, in a sense where it's like what the depolarization, it isn't just about getting along at Thanksgiving, it's or being able to not talk about politics. It's realizing that, like, we're going to have a government and we're going to have issues. We need to have policies on things. We need to have laws. We're going to have rules and regulations, and we need to be able to discuss these productively. And like we want the
Like
government
adults.
to, yeah, we want the government to work well, and whether you come at that from the left or the right, obviously, people on the left are on average going to support, more spending and higher taxes, and the government is going to do things in a slightly different way than if you're coming at it from the right, where you might favor lower taxes and lower regulations. Um, but like the real common ground is that people understand that there's a need for the government, and you want the government to work well and to do good things. And it's much easier to have those discussions and get to some mutually agreeable point, or some point that will remain mutually agreeable for a few years, because obviously conditions change. It's much easier to get there if you can talk about it and talk about it productively.
Mhm.
And
Mhm.
that's true at the both for people that are actually in the in the room where it happens, or in Congress, or in state legislatures, but it's also it's true for all of us.
Yeah. Yeah. I think, yeah, to tie it into the main theme, it's like the more people can see the self reinforcing nature of these things, the conflict, the more they'll be incentivized to approach conflict in more healthy and more mature ways. I think because I think yeah, people need to see what's in it for them, and not
Hmm.
just as some abstract like let's all get along concept. We need to see
Right.
what's in it for all of us with these ideas. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, that is great. Thank you very much, Zach Elwood of Diffusing American Anger. All right, and that was the interview. Thank you very much for listening. If you wouldn't mind, please do leave a review for the podcast. I believe those are important. And subscribe to the newsletter, which will be linked in the show notes, or can be found at neverclosetheinquiry.substack.com. Thanks.